Some stories don't start with thunder or fanfare. They start with dust on a road and a woman who has learned not to ask for much. I wrote this for folks who understand that second chances don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, often wearing worn shoes and carrying little more than hope wrapped in practical clothes. This is a tale for those of us who know what it means to rebuild after loss, who understand that the deepest connections aren't forged in grand gestures, but in shared work. Quiet evenings, and the courage to open a gate when everything in you says, keep it closed. If you've ever watched someone walk toward you and known, somehow, that nothing would be quite the same afterward, this story is for you. Set your coffee down. Stay a while. The gatepost had been loose for 3 weeks. Silas Redmond wrapped the wire around it for the 4th time. Fingers moving from memory. Twist left. Pull tight. Twist again. The metal bit into his palms through the leather of his work gloves. He didn't adjust his grip. 50 years old. And his hand still knew what to do, even when his mind wandered elsewhere. Behind him, the windmill creaked that same tired complaint it had been making since spring. Needed oiling. He'd get to it one of these days. Or he wouldn't. Made no difference to anyone but the wind. The smell of sage drifted across the yard, mixing with the dry grass and the faint manure scent from the barn. Familiar smells. The smells of a life that had shrunk down to just this fence posts and feed schedules and the long silence between sunrise and dark. Silas straightened, pressing one hand against his lower back, where the ache had taken up permanent residence. The sun hung low over the western ridge, painting the sky copper and rust. Another day ending. He'd mended the fence, fed the chickens, checked the cattle in the lower pasture. Tomorrow he'd do it again. This was enough, he told himself. This was enough. Dust moved on the road. He squinted against the light. The road ran straight for nearly a mile before it curved toward his gate, so a rider would have been visible by now. But this wasn't a rider. The dust rose low and steady, the way it did when something moved slowly, a wagon with a broken wheel, maybe, or livestock wandered from the Murphy ranch. He watched. The shape came clear by degrees. Not a wagon, not livestock, a woman, walking alone, carrying something in her right hand, a bag. He realized, as she drew closer, a carpet bag with brass clasps that caught the fading light. No wagon behind her, no horse, no companion. Silas pulled the gloves from his hands slowly. His land sat 12 miles from Stillwater. 12 miles was a long walk for anyone. For a woman alone, carrying her belongings, it was something else entirely. She stopped at the gate. Didn't touch the latch, didn't call out. Just stood there while the late sun caught the gray threads in her dark hair. Her dress had faded to a color that might once have been blue calico, washed too many times, carrying the dust of the road on its hem and shoulders. Silas walked toward her. Up close, he could see the tired lines around her eyes. She wasn't young, 40, maybe, or close to it. Her face held the kind of stillness that came from long practice, the expression of someone who had learned to wait without expecting. "Reckon you could use a hand around here." Her voice surprised him. Not pleading, not desperate, just a question. Asked the way you might ask about the chance of rain. Silas didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her hands. They hung at her sides, palms slightly turned outward. calluses thick across the base of each finger, the kind that came from years of work. Not soft hands, not beggar's hands, working hands. "Long walk from town," he said. "It was... no wagon? Sold it, horse too, didn't get much for either. But it's lighter traveling without." He studied her face. She met his eyes without flinching, without looking away, without the false brightness some folks put on when they wanted something. Her gaze held a patience that seemed to go all the way down, like water in a deep well. The windmill creaked behind him. Silas thought about the fence line he still hadn't finished. The vegetable garden gone to weeds since Ellen passed. The chicken coop with wire sagging in 3 places. 6 years of letting things slide. And the ranch showed every bit of it. He reached for the gate latch. "Bunkhouse is past the barn," he said, nodding toward the building. "Pump's in the yard. Supper's your own affair." She nodded once. No smile. No flood of thanks. No questions about wages or duties. Just acceptance of terms offered. He swung the gate open. She walked through without looking back, her boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. The carpetbag swung at her side, brass clasps winking in the last of the light. He watched her cross the yard, pace steady, unhurried, until she reached the bunkhouse door and stepped inside. Silas stood at the open gate longer than he should have. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage and the distant low of cattle settling for the night. The sun touched the ridge, balanced there, then slipped below. He hadn't asked her name. The thought arrived slow, like water finding its way through cracked earth. She'd asked for work. He'd pointed her to the bunkhouse, somewhere in that exchange. The ordinary courtesies had fallen away, or maybe he'd set them aside on purpose. The way you avoid picking up something you're not ready to hold. Tomorrow, he'd ask. Set out the work proper. Explain what was expected. Tonight. He walked back to the main house alone. Same as he had for 6 years. But when he reached the porch and turned to look across the yard, light glowed in the bunkhouse window. First light in that building since old Henry packed up and headed for Oregon 4 years back. Silas stood on his porch, coffee cup forgotten on the rail, watching that small square of yellow in the gathering dark. He should go inside. Heat up the leftover beans, wind the clock, do all the things that filled the hours between sundown and sleep. Instead, he stayed where he was. The evening air carried that sharpness that said summer had finally let go that particular October smell of leaves starting to turn and wood smoke drifting from somewhere miles away. In a few weeks, the cottonwoods along the creek would go gold. The nights would grow cold enough for a second blanket. He wondered if the bunkhouse roof still leaked where he'd patched it 3 years back. The lamp in the window flickered once, then steadied. Silas finally turned and went inside. But he left his own lamp burning longer than usual. No particular reason. Just seemed like the thing to do. In the bunkhouse, Clara Whitmore set her carpetbag on the narrow bed and looked around the small room. A stove in the corner. Cold. A table with 1 chair. A washstand with a chipped basin. A window that faced the main house across the yard. She'd slept in worse places these past 2 years. The room smelled of dust and years of emptiness. But underneath that, faintly, she caught cedar. Someone had lined the walls with care once, chosen good wood, a small kindness built into the bones of the place. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, through the window. She could see the rancher's house, lamplight visible in one window. He hadn't asked her name, hadn't asked where she came from or where she was heading, just looked at her hands and opened the gate. She understood that kind of looking. William, her husband, used to look at a person's shoes first, said you could tell everything about someone from their feet. Clara had never been certain about that a person could come into money and still walk like they were used to. Nothing. But she understood the impulse, the need to read people quick, sort them into categories that made sense. This rancher had chosen hands. She turned her own over in the lamplight. Calloused. Yes. Weathered. Nails kept short for practical reasons. These hands had milked cows and mended fences, had dug graves and planted seeds, had held a dying man's fingers until the last warmth left them. Still good hands. Though, that counted for something. From her carpet bag. Clara took out 2 objects, a pocket watch, tarnished silver, the chain broken. Williams. She'd sold the chain, but kept the watch. Though it hadn't run in years, some things weren't worth anything except to the person holding them. The second object was smaller. A wooden button, hand-carved with a pattern of leaves around the edge. She closed her fingers over it, held it for a moment, then set it on the table beside the watch. She didn't let herself think about where the button came from. Not tonight. Tonight she had a roof and a bed and the promise of work come morning. That was enough. She told herself that was enough. If this story speaks to you, I hope you'll stay for what comes next. A like or a follow means more than you know. It helps these quiet tales find others who might need them. Leave a comment and tell me where you're reading from. As my grandmother used to say, good company makes any journey shorter. The pump handle resisted on the first pull. Clara leaned her weight into it, feeling the cold metal through her palms. The mechanism groaned, seized, then gave way with a shudder that traveled up through her arms into her shoulders. Water splashed into the bucket, brown at first, carrying rust, then clearing to something she could use. She'd been awake for an hour already. Old habit. The rooster hadn't crowed yet, but the darkness had started thinning at the edges, that gray time between night giving up and morning taking hold, somewhere in the barn. A horse stamped and blew, footsteps on packed earth. She kept pumping, the bucket filled slowly, water sloshing against tin. "You're up early." His voice came from behind her, rough with sleep or disuse, hard to tell which. "Habit," she said. Clara straightened and turned. The rancher stood near the barn door, suspenders hanging loose. Shirt buttoned wrong, 3rd button through the 4th hole, his hair stuck up on one side. His jaw carried 2 days of stubble going on 3. He looked like a man who had stopped checking mirrors a long time ago. Work's simple enough. He didn't quite meet her eyes. Fences need mending along the south line. Chickens need feeding morning and evening. Coop wire's gone loose, you'll see where. She nodded. Cattle mostly mind themselves this time of year. Count heads in the lower pasture every few days. Make sure none slipped through the breaks in the fence. Another nod. He shifted his weight, one hand rubbing the back of his neck. "Room and board, nothing more. We clear? Clear. Questions?" Clara looked past him at the yard. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. Weeds choked what had been a vegetable garden near the house. A rusted plow blade lay beside the water trough, half buried in dirt. Everything here had the look of a place where someone had stopped trying. None that matter, she said. Something moved across his face. Surprise. Maybe. Or relief. Gone before she could name it. He turned toward the barn without another word. Clara carried the water bucket toward the bunkhouse, then stopped. The vegetable garden. She set the bucket down and walked to the edge of the overgrown plot. Thistle and ragweed stood waist-high, but underneath she could see the bones of careful planning. Rows still visible beneath the tangle. Wooden stakes where tomatoes had climbed, a border of flat stones, half buried now, placed with deliberate care. A woman's work. That much was plain. Clara knelt and pulled the first weed. The roots came up hard, clinging to soil they'd claimed. She pulled another. Another. She didn't look toward the barn. Didn't check to see if he was watching. Some things you did because they needed doing. By the time the sun broke over the ridge, she'd cleared a corner just enough to show the dark earth beneath. Her knees ached. Her back would remember this tomorrow, but the border stones were visible now, and on one of them, half hidden by dirt she'd brushed away. Someone had carved 2 letters into the rock, E-R, the same initials on the apron she'd seen hanging in the kitchen window. The chicken wire bit into Clara's fingers as she twisted it around the post. 7 days now. 7 mornings of rising before the rooster found his voice. 7 evenings of lamplight in the bunkhouse window. She'd learned the rhythm of this place when the cattle moved to water, when the old mare in the barn started pawing for her feed, when the rancher emerged from the barn where he slept, instead of the house. She'd learned other things, too. The twist went left first, then right. Then left again. She'd watched him mend wire on the 3rd day, standing in the shadow of the barn door, where he couldn't see her. Memorizing the movement of his hands. The technique was particularly different from what William had used. Different from what her father taught her back in Kansas. But there was sense to it. The twist on the inside meant no snags on feathers, no torn combs when the birds pressed against the wire. Clara finished the last wrap and stepped back, clean, tight, matching the sections he'd mended on the other side of the coop. From across the yard, she felt his gaze before she turned to meet it. He stood near the water pump, tin cup in hand, watching. Not hiding it, just looking. The way you might study a horse you hadn't quite figured out yet. She held his look for a moment. Then she moved to the next section of sagging wire. The cup clinked against the pump handle as he set it down. His footsteps faded toward the barn. That was how they lived now, in glances and silences, in work completed without discussion. She fixed what needed fixing. He noticed, neither spoke of it. Sunday came with church bells faint on the wind, carried from town 12 miles distant. Clara watched from the bunkhouse window as Silas hitched the buckboard, climbed onto the seat, and drove toward the road. He didn't look back. She waited until the dust settled, until the creak of wheels faded to nothing. Then she walked to the barn. The whitewash had caught her eye, 3 days past a half-empty bucket pushed into a corner, the brush beside it stiff with dried paint. Someone had started the job and never finished. The bunkhouse porch had gone gray with weather and neglect. Boards rough enough to catch splinters through her stockings. Clara carried the bucket to the yard, stirred the whitewash until the lumps broke apart, dipped the brush. The first stroke went on bright against weathered wood. She worked without stopping, board to board, section to section. The October sun climbed higher. Sweat gathered at her temples, ran down her neck, soaked the collar of her dress. Her shoulders burned with the motion dip. Stroke, dip, stroke. The smell of whitewash filled her nose, sharp and clean, covering the dust and old wood. When the last board shone wet in the afternoon light, Clara sat on the top step and let her arms hang loose. Her back ached deep. Her hands cramped when she tried to make a fist. But the porch looked like something again, like a place somebody cared about. Dust rose on the road. The buckboard appeared slow. The way everything appeared on these flat stretches, a dark shape against the horizon. Growing larger by degrees. Clara watched it come, her hands resting on her knees. Silas pulled the horses to a stop near the barn, climbed down, started unloading supplies, flour sack, coffee tin, a coil of new rope. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He didn't look toward the bunkhouse. Then he did. His hands went still on the rope. His head turned, just slightly, taking in the white porch, the wet gleam of fresh paint, the empty bucket near her feet. Clara didn't stand, didn't speak. He finished unloading in silence, led the horses to the barn, disappeared inside. The sun dropped lower. The whitewash dried to a clean, even white. That night, Clara found a tin of peaches on the bunkhouse step. No note, no knock she'd heard. Just the tin sitting there when she opened the door to shake out her washing rag. The label was hand-printed in faded ink, Freestone Peaches, Patterson's Orchard, 1881. 2 years old. But tinned fruit kept. Clara picked it up. The metal sat cool and heavy in her palm. She carried it inside and set it on the small table beside the bed. The lamp flame bent in a draft from the window, throwing shadows that jumped and settled. She looked at the tin for a long moment. Then she opened her carpet bag. The pocket watch came out first. Williams. She set it on the table beside the peaches, tarnished silver, dull against worn wood. Then the button. Small, wooden, carved with a pattern of leaves around the edge, uneven leaves, cut by hands that hadn't quite mastered the knife yet. 7-year-old hands. Clara held it in her closed fist, feeling the edges press into her palm. Then she set it beside the watch. 3 objects now. The watch that didn't run. The button she couldn't explain. The tin of peaches from a man who still hadn't asked her name. Clara turned down the lamp and lay on the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into night. The windmill turning, smooth now since she'd oiled it 2 days back. A cow calling somewhere in the dark pasture. The soft shift of horses in their stalls. And something else. Footsteps on the main house porch, the creak of weight settling into a chair. She turned her head toward the window. Through the glass. She could make out his shape, the rancher sitting on his porch steps. A cup in his hands. His face turned toward the bunkhouse, toward her window. Her lamp was out. He couldn't see her watching him watch her. But the weight of his attention pressed through the darkness anyway, gentle and strange, like a hand resting on a door that hadn't been opened in a very long time. Morning would come soon, fences to mend, chickens to feed, wire to twist in that particular way she'd learned from watching without being seen. But a question followed her toward sleep, turning over and over like a stone in moving water in 6 years of living alone on this ranch. What had made him walk across that dark yard tonight And why had he left the one thing that couldn't be mistaken for wages? The fence post steadied under Clara's grip as Silas drove the final nail. 3 weeks had built this not conversation, not explanation, but the slow accumulation of mornings spent working the same stretch of land. She held. He hammered. He measured. She cut. The language between them had become one of handed tools and nodded directions, of tasks begun and finished without a word wasted. The hammer struck twice more. Silas stepped back, testing the post with the toe of his boot. It held firm. "That's the last of this section," he said. Clara released her grip and wiped her palms on her apron. The October sun had lost its summer bite, but her shoulders still ached from holding the post steady. Her arms would remind her of this work tomorrow, and the day after that. "South line next." He nodded, already gathering tools. She bent to collect the scattered nails, dropping them one by one into the tin can he'd brought. Each one pinged soft against the others, hoofbeats on the road. They both turned. A rider approached from the east, following the fence line they'd just mended. Clara recognized the roan mare before she placed the man, the Murphy ranch hand who'd passed by 2 weeks back. The one whose eyes had lingered a beat too long when he looked at her. Tom Harkins. She'd learned his name from the brand on his saddle when he'd stopped to water his horse at the trough. He slowed as he reached them, tipping his hat in a gesture that included them both, but settled on Clara. "Mr. Redmond, ma'am, Harkins." Silas's voice carried no warmth. "Mending the south fence, I see." Harkins shifted in his saddle, leather creaking beneath him. "That section's been down since spring. Getting to it now. Murphy's wondering if you'll join the drive this year. Could use the extra hands." "I'll think on it." "Sure." Harkins touched his hat brim again, eyes sliding back to Clara. "Ma'am," he rode on. Clara felt the weight of his backward glance without turning to confirm it. The hoofbeats faded slow, swallowed by the empty land. Silas stood still, watching the rider disappear over the low rise to the north. "Drives in 3 weeks," he said finally. "Usually help move the Murphy herd. Share the profit." Clara picked up the hammer he'd set down. "You should go, then. Maybe." He took the hammer from her hand, their fingers brushing. His skin was rough, calloused in different places than hers. The heel of his palm where tool handles wore, the base of his thumb where the hammer struck true. "South line's a 2-day job," he said, not looking at her. "Best start fresh tomorrow." They walked back toward the house in silence, tools clanking soft with each step. The sun hung low over the western ridge, stretching their shadows long across the dry grass. Clara matched her pace to his without thinking about it, not quite together, not quite apart, quite. The rhythm they'd fallen into these weeks without either of them planning it. At the pump, they stopped. Silas worked the handle while Clara held the bucket. Water splashed cold over her wrists, soaking her sleeves to the elbow. She didn't pull back. The shock of it felt good after hours under the sun. "Windmill's running smooth," she said. He paused mid-pump. "Oiled it last week," she added. "Found the can in the barn." For a moment he just looked at her. The silence held 3 heartbeats. 4. "You know windmills. Grew up with them? Kansas?" "Kansas." He let the pump handle rest. "Long way from Wyoming." "Most places are long from somewhere." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. the first crack in his expression she'd seen that wasn't tied to work or weather. "Parts for the gears are in the barn somewhere," he said, "case you need them." "Already found them." He let out a breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. Shook his head once. The bucket overflowed. Clara lifted it, water sloshing over the rim onto her boots. Neither of them mentioned the waste. That evening, she sat on the bunkhouse porch as stars pricked through the darkening sky. The October air carried a sharpness that hadn't been there last week, a hint of what was coming. The cold waiting just over the horizon. She pulled William's old coat tighter around her shoulders. The wool still smelled faintly of him. Or maybe she only imagined it did. Across the yard, light glowed in the main house window. Then the front door opened. Silas stepped onto his porch carrying a cup. He didn't look toward the bunkhouse, just sat on the top step, the same way he'd sat every night since she arrived. But tonight, she wasn't hidden behind her window. Tonight, she sat in plain view, 30 yards away. Visible to anyone who cared to look. He knew she was there. She knew he knew. Neither spoke. Clara listened to the windmill turn smooth now. No creak, the gears running the way they should. The blades caught what was left of the light and let it go. Caught and released. Caught and released. "Cold coming," Silas said. His voice carried clear in the still air. Not shouted, just spoken, as if the distance between their porches meant nothing more than the width of a kitchen. "Feels like it," Clara answered. Quiet settled back over the yard. But different now. Warmer. Somehow. Despite the chill creeping into the night. "My wife planted that garden." Clara's hands went still on her knees. "The one by the house," he continued. "Ellen. She had a way with growing things." Ellen, E.R., the initials carved into stone, the apron hanging in the window. "I saw the border stones," Clara said carefully. "Someone put real thought into them. She hauled them up from the creek, spent a whole summer finding ones she liked." A pause. The cup rose and fell as he drank. "I should have kept it up better. It's still there. Underneath." He didn't answer that. A coyote called somewhere in the distant hills, its voice thin and lonesome against the dark. "How long?" Clara asked. She felt him understand the question without her finishing it. 6 years. Fever. I'm sorry. It was quick. At least, that's what the doctor said." The chair creaked as he shifted his weight. "Never been sure if that makes it better or worse." Clara thought of William. The slow fade that had given her time to prepare, and no time at all. 4 years of watching him weaken, knowing what was coming, powerless to stop it. "Mine took 2 years," she heard herself say. The fever didn't kill him outright, just wore him down piece by piece. "Recent, 2 years gone now, since the end, I mean." The arithmetic hung between them. 4 years of dying, 2 years of alone, 6 years total, same as his, just arranged different. "You've been moving since town to town, worked where I could, kept walking when I couldn't." Silas set his cup down on the porch beside him. The soft clink of tin on wood carried across the yard. "You do good work," he said. "Better than most hands I've hired. I've had practice. I can see that." Clara pulled the coat tighter. The stars had come out full now, scattered thick across the black, more of them than she'd seen in years. Out here where no town lights dimmed them down. "The Murphy Drive," she said. "You should go." I can manage the place. Maybe. She heard him stand, heard the boards creak under his weight. Good night, Mrs. He stopped. Clara turned to look at him. Finally. Directly. He stood framed against the light from his window, face in shadow. Whitmore, she said. Clara Whitmore. Silas Redmond. I know. Saw your name on the deed notice in the barn. That almost smile again, barely there in the darkness. Good night, Mrs. Whitmore. Good night, Mr. Redmond. His door closed. The light in the window stayed on, casting its yellow square across the empty porch where he'd been sitting. Clara remained outside a while longer, watching the stars wheel slow overhead. Her name in his mouth had sounded strange formal after 3 weeks of working side by side without it. But right, too. A line drawn that made the space between them easier to cross. She stood to go inside, then stopped. The main house light had dimmed, lamp turned down, but not out, and in the window, just visible, a figure stood watching. He wasn't hiding it, wasn't pretending otherwise, just standing at the glass, looking out at the dark yard and the woman crossing it. Clara's hand rested on her door. Across 30 yards of hard-packed earth, something passed between them that needed no words, not a question, not an answer, just recognition. She went inside and closed the door soft behind her. But she lay awake a long time after, listening to the windmill turn and thinking about the way he'd said her name. In the main house. The lamp finally went dark, and somewhere out on the road, growing closer. The Murphy Ranch hand was riding back toward town with news that would spread faster than any fever. The calf bawled, high and panicked. Clara dropped the fence post and ran toward the sound. The creek had swollen overnight. October rains pushing down from the mountains, turning the shallow crossing into something deeper and faster than it had any right to be. Brown water churned with silt, carrying branches and dead leaves from upstream. The calf had wandered in at the wrong spot. Now it stood chest-deep in mud at the creek's edge, legs sunk past the knee, each struggle driving it deeper into the muck. Silas appeared beside her, rope already in his hands. Hold this end, he thrust the coiled slack toward her. I'll get the loop around. He waded into the water before she could answer. The current caught his legs and shoved him sideways. He braced against it and pushed forward. Water climbed to his waist, then his chest. Cold, she could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his breath came shorter. The calf's eyes rolled white as he approached, its bawling turning to something closer to a scream. Clara wrapped the rope around her waist and planted her boots in the soft earth. Her heels dug in, finding purchase in the root systems beneath the mud. The rope bit into her palms through her work gloves. Easy now. Silas's voice barely carried over the rush of water. Easy, there. He reached the calf. His hands moved slow, careful, giving the animal time to see him, to understand he wasn't a threat. The calf tried to lunge away, but the mud held it fast. Silas worked the loop over its head, under one front leg, across the chest. His fingers fumbled with the knot, the cold water stealing feeling from his hands. Pull when I say. Clara adjusted her grip. The rope went taut between them. Now. She pulled. Her boots slid in the mud. She dug in harder, throwing her weight back. The rope burned through her gloves. Silas pushed from behind. His shoulder braced against the calf's hindquarters. For a long moment, nothing happened. The mud sucked and held, refusing to give up what it had claimed. Then a sound like a cork pulling free from a bottle, and the calf lurched forward. Clara stumbled back, keeping tension on the line. The calf scrambled toward the bank, legs churning, black mud flying. It reached solid ground and stood shaking, sides heaving, but alive. Silas lost his footing. The brown water closed over his head. Clara's hands clenched on the rope. 1 second, 2. His head broke the surface, sputtering, gasping. He found his feet and staggered toward the bank, water streaming from his clothes, his hair plastered flat against his skull. He collapsed on the creek bank beside her. They sat there, both breathing hard, both covered in mud. The October sun felt thin against wet clothes and cold, soaked skin. Clara's hands shook not from the cold, not from the effort, from that moment when he'd gone under, that 1 second when she couldn't see him. "Fool calf," Silas said between breaths. A sound escaped Clara's throat. Laughter. It came out rough and sudden, surprising her as much as him. Silas turned to look at her, mud streaking his face, creek water dripping from his eyebrows, and then he was laughing too. A short, rusty sound, like something that hadn't been used in a long time. The calf shook itself, spraying them both with muddy water. Clara raised her arm to block her face, still laughing. Silas leaned back on his elbows, chest still heaving, looking up at the gray sky. The laughter faded slow, like embers cooling. "Can't remember the last time I did that," Clara said. Silas didn't answer right away, just lay there, breathing, staring at the clouds moving overhead. "Same," he said finally. The creek rushed past, indifferent to both of them. The calf had already started grazing. Fear forgotten. Nothing in its head but the next mouthful of grass. Cattle were like that. No memory for what almost killed them. "My husband." The words came out before Clara could stop them, pulled loose by the laughter or the shared struggle, or simply the fact of sitting side by side in the mud with nothing left to pretend about. "William, fever took him. 2 years back now." Silas sat up slowly, crossing his arms over his knees. "He was a dreamer," she continued. "Good man, but his head was always somewhere else. Some plan, some scheme, some better place waiting just over the next hill." She picked up a stone from the creek bank and turned it in her fingers, feeling its smooth weight. "Lost 2 farms that way, chasing what wasn't there instead of tending what was. Sounds hard? It was what it was." She threw the stone into the water. It disappeared without a sound, swallowed by the current. "I loved him anyway. You don't always get to choose what makes sense." Silas nodded slowly. His hands hung loose between his knees, still dripping creek water, turning red from the cold. "Ellen was different," he said. "Practical. Knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. She's the one who found this land. Saw what it could be." A long pause. "I just followed where she pointed. You built this place together." "She built it. I kept it standing after." His voice went flat. "Barely." Clara looked at the ranch spread out before them, the house, the barn, the fences they'd mended together over these weeks, the garden she'd started clearing, the windmill she'd oiled, the chicken coop with wire that finally held tight. "More than barely," she said. Silas turned to look at her. His eyes were brown. She really noticed for the first time. Dark brown. Like creek water in autumn. Like good earth turned for planting. Lines at the corners from years of squinting against the sun. "She died in the bedroom," he said. "The one in the house. That's why I sleep in the barn." Clara's breath stopped in her chest. 6 years, he continued, his voice gone quiet. "Haven't set foot in that room since. Can't make myself cross the threshold. The apron in the window, still hanging where she left it, the morning she took sick." Clara thought of her own ghosts. The pocket watch that didn't run. The wooden button carved with uneven leaves. The way grief attached itself to objects and made them both sacred and unbearable. "I have a button," she said softly. "In my bag, wooden, carved with leaves around the edge." She felt him waiting. "My daughter made it." The words came hard, dragged up from somewhere deep. "Tried to make it. She was 7. Still learning how to handle the knife." The only sound was the creek rushing past and the wind in the cottonwoods. "Fever?" Silas asked. His voice was careful, the way you'd handle something fragile. "Same one that took William. She went first. He followed 3 weeks later." Clara's hands lay still in her lap now. The shaking stopped. The telling had steadied something inside her, given the grief shape and edges it hadn't had before. "I've been walking since. Couldn't stay in a place where I kept expecting to hear her voice around every corner." Silas said nothing, but he reached out, slowly, and laid his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. His palm was cold from the creek, rough with calluses, heavy with the weight of a man who understood exactly what it meant to carry the dead. They sat that way for a long time. The creek rushing past. The calf grazing peaceful. The October sun breaking through the clouds to warm them both. Then Clara stood, pulling her hand gently free. "We should get that calf back to the herd," she said. "And you need dry clothes before you catch your death." Silas stood too, mud squelching under his boots. "Wouldn't that be something? Save a calf, die of the chill. Ain't much of a trade. No, reckon not." They walked back toward the house, the calf following docile, now that dry ground was certain. Their steps fell into the rhythm they'd developed over these weeks, matched pace, comfortable distance, 2 people moving in the same direction without needing to discuss it. At the yard, they separated. Silas toward the barn for dry clothes, Clara toward the bunkhouse to change her mud-soaked dress. But at her door, she stopped. Something was different. The bunkhouse porch, the one she'd whitewashed 2 weeks back, now held a second chair. Oak, straight-backed, positioned beside the one that had always been there. Clara stared at it. She turned toward the barn, but Silas had already disappeared inside. The chair sat in the afternoon light, plain and solid, offering nothing but its presence. 2 chairs. She thought of the main house porch, where he sat alone every night. Thought of the 30 yards between his steps and hers. Thought of how that distance had felt like both a wall and a bridge these past weeks. Now there were 2 chairs on her porch. Clara walked toward them slowly, ran her hand along the back of the new one. The wood was smooth, recently sanded. Someone had taken care with this. She sat down in it. The chair creaked once, then held steady. That evening, when the sun went down and the stars came out, She didn't watch from inside her window. She sat on her porch, in the new chair, and waited. Across the yard, the main house door opened, and Silas walked out carrying 2 cups instead of 1. The general store smelled of coffee beans and kerosene, and the faint sourness of pickles in the barrel by the door. Silas pushed through, the bell overhead jangling against the frame. He moved toward the back counter where the feed sacks lined the wall, tallying in his head what he needed. Flour, salt, coffee, a new buckle for the harness strap that had snapped last week. The store went quiet. He noticed it the way you notice a sudden drop in temperature, the conversation that had been humming when he entered cut short, replaced by a particular kind of silence. The silence of people trying not to look at something while looking at nothing else. Mrs. Patterson stood behind the counter, her hands busy arranging and rearranging a display of tinned goods that didn't need arranging. 2 women near the fabric bolts turned their backs slightly, heads bent together, their whispers just loud enough to carry without being understood. Silas ignored it, reached for a sack of flour. "Mr. Redmond?" The voice came from his left. Harold Meeks stepped out from behind a shelf of dry goods. Black wool coat brushed clean. Silver watch chain catching the light from the front window. Deacon at the Methodist Church. Owned the 2nd largest spread in the territory. The kind of man who believed his opinions carried the same weight as Scripture. "Meeks," Silas continued, loading his arms. "Been meaning to speak with you." Harold moved closer, positioning himself between Silas and the counter. "About a matter of some concern." Silas set down the flour sack, met Harold's eyes directly. "Say what you came to say." Harold glanced around the store, making sure of his audience. Mrs. Patterson had stopped pretending with the tins. The 2 women by the fabric had turned back, watching openly now. "People are talking," Harold said, his voice pitched to carry. "About your place, about the woman living out there." Silas's jaw tightened. He felt the muscle jump beneath his skin. "That's so. You know how it looks. A widow, living alone on a man's property. No chaperone, no proper arrangement." Harold spread his hands in a gesture of false helplessness. "No propriety. She works my ranch, earns her keep." "I don't doubt it." Harold's smile didn't reach his eyes. "But we have standards in this community. Silas, ways of doing things that decent folk follow. Ellen would have understood that." The name landed like a slap across the face. Silas's hands curled into fists at his sides. He breathed through the heat building in his chest, the urge to put those fists where they'd do some good. Harold watched him, waiting, wanting exactly the kind of reaction he could point to later. "Ellen," Silas said slowly, measuring each word, "would have told you to mind your own business." He grabbed the flour sack, turned to the counter. "Mrs. Patterson, I'll take this. A tin of coffee, and 5 pounds of salt." Mrs. Patterson hesitated, her eyes flicking to Harold. Then she began measuring out the order, her movements quick and jerky. "Think about what I said." Harold's voice followed him. "For your sake, and for hers." Silas paid, loaded his supplies, walked out without looking back. But Harold's words sat in his gut like a stone, cold and heavy. All the way home, Clara was on the windmill ladder when he returned. He saw her from the road, a figure high above the ground, one arm hooked through the rungs, the other working an oil can into the gears. The blades stood motionless, locked in place by a pin she'd rigged from baling wire. She'd found parts he couldn't remember buying. Fixed problems he'd ignored for years. Silas pulled the buckboard to a stop and sat watching her. The sun had started its slide toward evening, casting long shadows across the yard. Her dress, the same faded calico she'd worn since arriving, caught the breeze and snapped against her legs. She climbed down, careful, one rung at a time, the empty oil can tucked under her arm, when her boots touched earth. She turned and saw him. Something in his face must have shown. "What happened?" she asked. Silas climbed down from the buckboard, started unloading supplies without answering, flour sack over his shoulder, coffee tin under his arm. "Silas!" He stopped at the sound of his name. First time she'd used it without the Mr. attached. "Town's talking," he said, not looking at her. "About you being here." Clara set the oil can down slowly. Her hands were steady, but a stillness came over her, the kind of stillness that meant bracing for a blow. "Saying what? What you'd expect. Woman living on a man's property, no chaperone." He spit the word like it tasted foul. "No propriety." Clara's chin lifted. A small movement. But he caught it. Who, Harold Meeks, owns a big spread east of town, thinks that gives him leave to preach at folk who don't ask his opinion. "And you, what did you say?" Silas finally looked at her. She stood straight backed against the fading light, arms at her sides, waiting, not pleading, not making excuses, just waiting to hear what came next. Told him to mind his own business. Something crossed her face. Relief. Maybe. Or surprise. Gone before he could be certain. "I can be gone by morning," she said. "If that's what—" "No." The word came out harder than he intended. He softened his voice. "You do good work. Better than any hand I've hired in 10 years. He set down the supplies. "What Meeks thinks, what the whole town thinks, that ain't your concern. Or mine. It will be, if they keep at it. Let them—" Clara studied him, her eyes searching his face for something. He didn't know what she was looking for, didn't know what he wanted her to find. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why does it matter to you what happens to me?" Silas opened his mouth, closed it. The question hung between them, demanding an answer he wasn't sure he had. "Because it's right," he said finally. "You came here needing work. I had work that needed doing. Everything else is just noise folks make when they got nothing better to fill their time." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. Then she bent to pick up the oil can. "Windmill's fixed," she said. "Should run quiet now." She walked toward the barn to put away the tools, her back straight, her pace measured. Silas watched her go. Behind him, the windmill groaned once as she released the pin, then began to turn. The blades caught the wind smooth and easy, spinning without the creak that had been part of this place so long he'd stopped hearing it. Quiet where there had been complaint for years. He thought about that while he carried the supplies inside. That evening, Clara sat on her porch in the new chair. Across the yard, Silas sat on his steps, tin cup in hand. 30 yards of darkness between them. Same as every night. But the silence felt different now, charged with words unspoken. "I've lived with talk before," Clara said, her voice carrying clear across the gap. "Small towns in Kansas, they talk about everybody. Don't make it right. No, but it don't make it matter either, not unless you let it." Silas turned the cup in his hands. The The coffee had gone cold, but he didn't move to pour it out. "Meeks brought up Ellen," he said. "Used her name like he had any right to it." Clara was quiet, said she would have understood. About standards, about how things ought to be done. His voice roughened. He didn't know her. Not really. Nobody in that whole town knew her the way I did. What would she have said if she'd been there to hear him? Silas thought about that. Really thought. Ellen in the general store, facing down Harold Meeks with that particular set to her jaw that meant somebody was about to regret opening their mouth. "She would have smiled," he said slowly. "Real sweet. And then she would have told him the good Lord gave him 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, and maybe he ought to use them in that proportion." Clara laughed, that rough, surprised sound he'd heard by the creek. "Sounds like someone I would have liked. You would have. She would have liked you too." The words hung in the air between their porches, heavier than he'd intended. Clara didn't answer right away. The windmill turned smooth overhead, its repaired gears silent. An owl called from somewhere near the creek, low and questioning. "Silas." He looked toward her porch, though her face was lost in shadow. "Whatever happens with the town, whatever Meeks or anyone else decides to do, I'm grateful. For the work, for the—" She paused, searching. "For being treated like I matter." "You do matter." Simple words. He meant every one. The quiet stretched between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It held something else now. Something that had been building since she first walked up to his gate with dust on her shoulders and calluses on her hands. "Good night, Silas." "Good night. Clara." She went inside. Her lamp glowed briefly, then dimmed. Silas stayed on his porch a while longer, looking up at the stars. The coffee in his cup had gone cold enough to taste like the creek. He dumped it in the dirt beside the steps. Tomorrow he'd need to decide about the Murphy Drive. 3 weeks away, maybe 4. Good money if he went. Clara could manage the place alone, he'd seen enough to know that. But leaving meant leaving her here. Alone. With Meeks and his talk, and whoever else decided to make her life hard. He thought about that for a long time. Then he thought about the way she'd said his name. Inside the bunkhouse. Clara stood at her window, looking out at the dark shape of the main house. A rider passed on the distant road too far to see clearly, just movement against the lighter gray of the sky, heading toward town, or maybe toward the Murphy Ranch. She watched until the shape disappeared over the rise. Tomorrow. Word would spread. Harold Meeks would make sure of that. By Sunday, everyone in Stillwater would know about the widow living on Silas Redmond's property. They would draw conclusions, pass judgment. She'd been through this before. Other towns, other whispers. Usually she moved on before it got bad. Packed her carpet bag and walked to the next place, the next chance, the next stretch of empty road. But this time, Clara's fingers found the wooden button in her pocket. This time, someone had said she mattered. She pulled the curtain closed and lay down on the narrow bed. Through the thin walls, she could hear the windmill turning, smooth and steady. But another sound reached her too. Hoofbeats on the road. Coming from the direction of town. Coming fast. She sat up in the dark, listening. The rider stopped at the gate. The rider was Tom Harkins. Clara watched from behind her curtain as he swung down from the lathered roan, his movements jerky with haste. Silas had emerged from the barn. He must have heard the hoofbeats too, and stood in the yard. waiting. Their voices carried in the still night air. "Redmond, thought you ought to know." Harkins's breath came fast, his horse blowing hard from a run that had gone on too long. "Meeks called a meeting at the church tonight, after regular service." "What kind of meeting? The kind where men decide things about other men's business?" Harkins glanced toward the bunkhouse, saw the curtain move. "About the woman. About you." Clara's stomach folded in on itself. What did they decide? Nothing official. But Meeks has folk riled up, talking about decency, about setting an example for the community. Harkins shifted his weight. "He's coming here Sunday, with others, to talk sense into you," he says. Silas stood motionless in the moonlight. "Why tell me this?" "Because my sister's a widow, too. Lives in Cheyenne with 3 young ones, working her fingers raw as a seamstress." Harkins's voice dropped rough. "If she needed help, I'd want someone to give it without the whole territory making it ugly." Silas nodded slow. "I'm obliged. Don't be. Just be ready." Harkins mounted and rode off into the darkness. The hoofbeats faded until nothing remained but the wind and the distant complaint of a coyote. Clara opened her door. Silas turned at the sound. They looked at each other across the moonlit yard, she on her step, he near the barn, both frozen in the wake of what they'd heard. "You heard," he said. "I heard." She walked toward him, bare feet cold against the hard-packed earth. She hadn't bothered with shoes, hadn't thought about how it looked a woman in her nightdress crossing a man's yard in the dark. But the rules had already been broken by other people's assumptions. "I should go," she said when she reached him. "Before Sunday. Before they come." "No, Silas. This is my land." His voice was low but certain. "I say who stays and who goes. Not Meeks, not a meeting at a church, not anyone." "You don't understand what they can do." Clara's hands pressed against her stomach. "Holding something in. I've seen it before. Kansas, Nebraska. They don't need guns or fists, just whispers, just closed doors. They can make sure you never sell a calf at market, never get credit at the store, never have a neighbor who'll look you in the eye. Let them try. You'd lose everything. I already lost everything." The words came flat, stripped bare. "Ellen's gone. The life I had with her is gone. This ranch is just dirt, fences, animals that don't care who feeds them." Clara stared at him. "But you," he continued, his voice changing, "you came here and made it matter again. The work, the days, getting up in the morning with something to do besides wait for dark." He stopped, struggling with words that didn't come easy. "I ain't letting that go because Harold Meeks has opinions about how other folk should live." "Silas?" "Unpack that bag if you started packing it. You ain't leaving." He turned and walked toward the barn. Clara watched him disappear inside, heard the creak of the ladder as he climbed to the loft where he slept. She stood alone in the moonlight, her nightdress thin against the October cold, her feet numb on the frozen ground. Then she went back to the bunkhouse and did not sleep at all. Sunday came gray and cold, with clouds low enough to taste. Clara dressed in her one good dress, the dark wool she'd worn to William's funeral, and not touched since. She brushed her hair until it lay flat, then pinned it back the way her mother had taught her. Proper, respectable. If they were coming to judge, they would find nothing in her appearance to condemn. Silas appeared in his Sunday coat, the same brushed wool he'd worn to church the week before. His jaw was clean-shaved, nicked twice on the chin where the razor had slipped. His hair was combed back. He looked different, older somehow, and younger too, like a man readying himself for something he hadn't asked for, but wouldn't run from. "Stay inside when they come," he said. "No," he frowned. "Clara, I've spent 2 years hiding, running from whispers and sideways looks and folk who think they know what I am without asking." She met his eyes. "I'm done with hiding." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded. "Together." Then, they ate breakfast in the main house, first time she'd been inside since that evening she'd cooked supper a week past. Ellen's apron still hung on its hook. Her presence still filled the corners, the worn spots on the floor where her feet had crossed the same paths year after year. Clara didn't try to push it out. Some ghosts had earned the right to stay. At 10 o'clock, dust rose on the road. 3 wagons, 7 men, no women left behind to pray and wring their hands and pretend they had no part in what their husbands were doing. Silas stood on his porch. Clara stood beside him. The wagons stopped at the gate. Harold Meeks climbed down from the first, his black coat spotless, his silver watch chain catching what light the clouds let through. The others followed ranchers. Mostly. Faces Clara half recognized from her one trip to town. They gathered at the gate like crows settling on a fence rail. "Silas," but Meeks's voice carried the false warmth of a man who believed himself generous. "We've come to talk sense. Gates open. Say what you came to say." Meeks stepped through, the others following. They stopped 10 feet from the porch, arranged in a loose half-circle that felt more like a jury than a conversation. "We've discussed this matter among ourselves," Meeks said. "Prayed on it, even, and we've concluded that the current arrangement cannot continue." "That so? You're a respected man in this community." "Silas, Ellen was a pillar of our church. Her memory deserves better than—" His hand swept toward Clara. The bunkhouse, the suggestion of sin that needed no words. "This." Clara's face burned. Heat climbed her neck, spread across her cheeks like a brand. 7 pairs of eyes on her, measuring her, finding her wanting. "Mrs. Whitmore is a hired hand," Silas said. "Nothing more, nothing less." "Then why does she live on your property?" Peterson, the feed store man, stepped forward. "Why does she take supper at your table? Why ain't you hired a proper hand, a man like any decent rancher would?" "Because I hired the best worker who came to my gate. Whether they wear trousers or a skirt don't figure into it." "It figures into everything." Meeks's voice hardened. "You know how this looks. The whole territory knows, and we will not have our community's reputation dragged through the mud by one man's indiscretion." Indiscretion. The word hung in the air, staining everything it touched. "I've done nothing wrong." Clara heard her own voice, steadier than she felt. "Worked every day, earned my keep, slept in the bunkhouse alone every night since I arrived. No one asked you to speak." Meeks didn't look at her. "Then somebody should have—" Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Clara and the assembled men. "She has a right to answer accusations made against her." "There are no accusations, only observations. And concerns." "Concerns." Silas tasted the word, spat it back. "You got concerns about who I hire to work land I've held for 20 years, land I built with my own hands alongside Ellen's." His voice dropped, quiet and dangerous. "You didn't come here with concerns. You came to feel righteous. To point at something you don't understand and call it wrong because it makes you fidget in your pew. Meeks's face reddened. Now see here. No, you see. Silas took another step forward. The men shifted, uncertain. I buried my wife 6 years back, lived alone on this land, doing work meant for 3 men, watching everything fall apart piece by piece because I couldn't keep up and couldn't make myself ask for help. Then this woman walks up to my gate and offers honest work for honest wages. And for the first time in 6 years, things start getting mended instead of falling down. He stopped, breathing hard. You want to call that improper? Fine. Call it what you want. But you will not come onto my land and tell me who stays and who goes. Not today. Not ever. Silence. The wind gusted, scattering dust across the yard. A chicken clucked behind the barn. The ordinary sounds of the ranch continuing on, indifferent to the drama at its center. Meeks drew himself up. You'll regret this, Silas. The community will remember. Let them. The men exchanged glances. The certainty they'd arrived with had cracked against Silas's refusal, one by one. They turned and walked back toward their wagons. Meeks went last. He paused at the gate. Ellen would be ashamed. Silas went rigid. Clara saw it, the blow landing, the wound ripping open. Ellen, Silas said slowly, would have shown you the gate 5 minutes ago, and she wouldn't have been near as polite about it. Meeks's face twisted. He climbed into his wagon without another word. The 3 wagons turned and rolled back toward the road, dust rising behind them like a judgment postponed rather than lifted. Clara and Silas stood on the porch until the last wagon vanished over the rise. Then Silas sat down heavy on the top step. His hands shook. Clara saw it, the tremor running through his fingers. The cost of standing firm when everything in him had wanted to break. She lowered herself beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Neither spoke. The windmill turned overhead. A crow called from the fence line. The sun tried to push through the clouds and failed. They won't stop, Clara said finally. Meeks won't let this go. I know. They'll come back. Or find quieter ways. Meaner ways. I know. She turned to look at him. His face had gone gray, the color of ashes, of exhaustion, of a man who had spent everything and wasn't sure where to find more. Why? She asked. Why fight so hard for someone you've known barely a month? Silas stared at the dirt between his boots. When you walked up to that gate, he said slowly, I saw somebody who'd been walking a long time, tired in a way that goes past bones and muscle, down into something deeper. He paused. I recognized it. Been feeling that same tired for 6 years. Clara's throat tightened. Turning you away would have been easier, he went on. Letting you go now would be easier still, but easy ain't the same as right. Ellen taught me that difference. He looked up at her, his brown eyes holding something she couldn't name. You matter, Clara. I don't know yet what that means. Don't know what any of this means. But you matter. And I ain't going to pretend otherwise just so Harold Meeks and his friends can sleep better at night. Clara's eyes burned. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. I haven't cried in 2 years, she said. Not since the funeral. Not once. Then don't start on my account. A sound escaped her half-laugh, half something else. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Silas reached out and laid his palm over her other hand, where it rested on her knee. Stay, he said. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Clara looked at their hands, his rough and weathered, hers scarred from work. Two damaged things finding balance against each other. "Together," she said. That night, Clara moved the second chair from her porch. She carried it across the yard and set it on the main house steps, beside the spot where Silas sat each evening. He watched her do it, saying nothing. When she sat down beside him, the 30 yards had collapsed to 2 feet, close enough to hear him breathe, close enough to feel warmth from his arm. They watched the stars come out in silence. "I haven't been inside the house at night," Clara said. "Not since that first supper. Didn't seem right. Does it seem right now?" She considered the weight of the question. "I don't know. But the chairs are here now. That's something." Silas nodded slowly. "Ellen used to sit where you're sitting, that exact spot." Clara started to rise. "No." His hand caught her wrist, gentle but firm. "Stay." She'd want somebody sitting there again, better than watching it rot empty year after year. Clara settled back. The moon rose over the eastern ridge, full and bright. Somewhere in the hills, coyotes began their chorus. The windmill turned in the darkness, smooth and silent. "What happens now?" Clara asked. "Sunday service next week. We go together. Show them we ain't ashamed of anything. They won't like that. No, they surely won't." Clara thought about walking into that white church with every eye on her. The whispers, the turned backs, the slow suffocation of judgment from folk who'd made up their minds before she ever opened her mouth. "I've never minded being alone," she said quietly. "Easier, in some ways. Nothing to lose." Silas turned to look at her, and now Clara met his eyes. In the moonlight they looked almost black, deep and unreadable. "Now I've got something worth losing." The words hung between them. Silas looked away first, back toward the stars. "Get some sleep," he said. "Work to do tomorrow." Clara rose, carrying her chair back across the yard, at the bunkhouse door. She turned. Silas still sat on his porch, but as she watched, he stood, walked toward the main house door, paused on the threshold, and stepped inside. Into the house where he hadn't slept in 6 years. Clara went into her own small room and lay down. Through her window, she watched light move through the main house, from kitchen to hallway. From hallway to a room in the back, the bedroom. The light stayed on for a long time. Then it went dark, and Clara fell asleep wondering what it meant that Silas Redmond had finally gone home. The buckboard rattled over rutted road toward Stillwater. Clara sat beside Silas on the bench seat, hands folded in her lap, spine straight as a fence post. The dark wool dress pressed stiff against her skin she'd washed and pressed it the night before, working by lamplight until every wrinkle surrendered. The bonnet she wore was new, cream-colored cotton, bought with wages Silas had insisted on paying despite her protests. Simple, respectable. If they wanted to see a woman of loose morals, they would have to look past what stood before them. Silas drove in silence, jaw set, eyes fixed on the road. He'd shaved that morning, nicking himself twice on the chin tiny cuts that had scabbed over, visible when the light caught them. His Sunday coat hung looser than it should. The weeks of work and worry had carved him leaner. The church steeple appeared over the rise, white against the gray November sky. Clara's stomach pulled tight. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs, feeling rough wool beneath her fingers, grounding herself in texture, in the physical world, in anything but the dread coiling through her chest. "We can still turn back," Silas said quietly. "No. Clara, you said we'd face this together." She turned to look at him. "Did you mean it?" His hands tightened on the reins. The leather creaked. "I meant it. Then we don't turn back." The buckboard rolled into town. People stopped on the wooden sidewalks. Conversations died mid-word. Clara felt eyes on her like heat from a stove pressing, measuring, cataloging every detail of her appearance for evidence of sin. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the church. Other wagons and horses lined the rail, their owners already inside. The bell had stopped 5 minutes past. They were late, deliberately. Better to walk in where everyone could see than slip through unnoticed like they had something to hide. Silas climbed down first, then turned and offered his hand. Clara took it. She stepped onto the hard-packed dirt, aware of how the gesture looked. A man helping a woman from a wagon. Simple, ordinary. Nothing ordinary about the silence that had fallen over the street. They walked toward the church doors together. Clara's boots sounded too loud on the wooden steps. The door handle was cold brass under Silas's grip. He pulled it open. The sanctuary stretched before them, rows of wooden pews facing the pulpit where Harold Meeks stood mid-sermon. Every head turned. Every face registered shock or disapproval or curiosity. Sometimes all three tangled together. Silas stepped inside. Clara followed. The door swung shut behind them with a sound like a gavel falling. "Ah," Meeks's voice carried from the pulpit, smooth as lamp oil. "Mr. Redmond, and guest, how good of you to join us." Silas didn't acknowledge him. He walked down the center aisle, Clara at his side, and stopped at an empty pew near the front. The same pew, Clara realized, where he must have sat with Ellen all those years ago. The wood bore faint marks of use, a groove where a hymnal had rested, a scratch where a ring had caught. He stepped aside to let her in first. She sat. He sat beside her. The congregation stared. Meeks cleared his throat, shuffling papers on his lectern. "As I was saying, we are called to be lights in the darkness, to hold ourselves to standards that reflect our faith and our community." His eyes flicked to Clara, then away. "When we see behavior that falls short of those standards, we have a duty, a sacred duty, to speak truth, to call sin by its name, to protect the innocent from corruption." Clara's face burned. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on the cross behind the pulpit, refusing to give Meeks the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Silas's hand found hers on the pew between them. His fingers closed around hers, firm and warm. A woman 3 rows back gasped. Meeks's sermon stumbled. His gaze caught on their joined hands, and for a moment, his composure cracked. Then he recovered, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Let us pray for those who have lost their way, who have allowed temptations to blind them to proper conduct. Let us pray they find strength to repent before it is too late." Clara bowed her head with the rest of the congregation, but she didn't close her eyes. Through her lashes, she watched the people around her. Mrs. Patterson sat rigid, hands clenched around her hymnal. Peterson kept glancing toward the door. A young woman Clara didn't recognize dark hair. Belly rounded with child beneath her Sunday dress, watched her with something that might have been sympathy. The prayer ended. The service continued. Clara sat through every hymn, every scripture reading, every pointed remark Meeks wove into his words. Her hand stayed clasped in Silas's. Her spine stayed straight. Her eyes stayed dry. When the final hymn ended, Meeks positioned himself at the door to greet his flock. The congregation filed out, giving Silas and Clara a wide berth. They were the last to leave their pew. Silas walked toward the door. Clara walked beside him. Meeks waited, his face arranged into pastoral concern that fooled no one. "Silas, I had hoped our conversation would have given you pause for reflection. It did. I reflected that you should tend your own affairs." Meeks's jaw tightened. "The moral welfare of this community is my affair." "Is it?" Silas stopped directly in front of him. "Then maybe worry about Tom Harkins's brother, who drinks himself blind every Saturday and beats his wife come Sunday. Or Peterson's son, who cheated 3 farmers out of seed money last spring. Or your own—" "That's enough." Meeks's voice dropped to a hiss. "No, it ain't near enough." Silas leaned closer. "You want to preach about sin, start with sins that actually hurt folk, not a widow earning honest wages on a working ranch." The congregants who had lingered on the church steps fell silent. Clara saw them watching shock on their faces, but something else too. Interest. The kind that came when a spectacle proved more complicated than expected. "Mrs. Whitmore." Meeks turned his attention to Clara, ignoring Silas. "Perhaps you could explain yourself. Help us understand why a respectable woman would place herself in such a compromising position." Every eye found her. Every judgment waited to be confirmed. Clara thought of all the towns she'd passed through, all the whispers she'd fled, all the times she'd lowered her head and kept walking because fighting back meant losing more than she could afford. But she was tired of walking. "My husband died 2 years ago." Her voice came out steady, surprising her. "Fever took him slow. I nursed him 4 years before the end. Sold everything we had to pay doctors who couldn't help." She paused, letting the words settle. "When he was gone, I had nothing, no family, no land, no place that would have me." The congregation listened. "I walked from Kansas to Wyoming looking for work, honest work, the kind that lets you sleep at night knowing you earned your keep." Clara lifted her chin. "Mr. Redmond gave me that. A job, a roof, a chance to stop running." She looked at Meeks directly. "If that's sin, then I reckon your definition needs some work." Silence. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a sound. Clapping. Clara turned to find its source. The pregnant woman, the one with dark hair and something like sympathy in her eyes. She was applauding. Alone at first. Then Mrs. Patterson joined, hesitant. Her face flushed. Then another woman, another. The men stood frozen. Uncertain. But the women were clapping. Not all of them, not even most, but enough. Meeks's face had gone the color of raw liver. "This is a house of worship," he sputtered. "Not a theater for Harold." The voice came from behind him. An older woman, white-haired, leaning heavy on a cane. Clara didn't know her, but from the way Meeks flinched, she was someone who mattered. "Mrs. Meeks," Silas said quietly. Ma'am. Harold's mother. The old woman hobbled forward, her cane tapping against the wooden floor. She stopped in front of Clara and studied her for a long moment. You nursed your husband 4 years. Yes, ma'am. Walked all the way from Kansas. Yes, ma'am. The old woman turned to her son. I nursed your father 3 years before he passed, walked beside him every step to the grave. Her voice cracked like a whip. If someone had offered me work and shelter after, I would have taken it, and I would have told anyone who objected to go straight to perdition. Meeks opened his mouth, closed it. We're going home now, Mrs. Meeks said. And you're going to think very hard about what kind of man you want to be, because the one standing before me right now ain't the one I raised. She turned and hobbled toward the steps without waiting to see if her son followed. He stood frozen for a moment. His face worked through emotions Clara couldn't name shame. Anger. Something that might have been recognition. Then, without a word, he walked after his mother. The crowd began to break apart. Not with warmth, Clara wasn't fool enough to expect that, but without the hostility that had greeted them, something had shifted. Silas touched her elbow. Let's go home. Home. The word settled in Clara's chest like a seed finding good soil. They drove in silence for the first mile. The road unspooled before them, landmarks of their daily life appearing one by one. The Murphy fence line, the creek crossing, the rise where the ranch first became visible. You didn't need me to speak for you, Silas said finally. No, you did fine on your own. I did. He glanced at her, something flickering in his eyes. Ellen would have liked what you said, about sin needing a better definition. Clara's throat tightened. You think so? I know so. She had strong opinions about folk who confused righteousness with cruelty. The ranch appeared ahead, windmill turning slow against the gray sky. House and barn and bunkhouse with its whitewashed porch, home. Silas pulled the buckboard to a stop in the yard, but didn't climb down. There's something I need to say. Clara waited. Last night, when I went into the house, into the bedroom. He stopped, hands tight on the reins. I sat on the bed where Ellen died. First time in 6 years. Clara's breath caught. I talked to her, out loud, told her about you, about everything that's happened. His voice roughened. Told her I thought maybe I was ready to stop just surviving. Start living again. The wind gusted, scattering dead leaves across the yard. What did she say? Clara asked softly. Silas turned to look at her. His eyes were wet. Nothing. She's been gone 6 years. There's nothing left to say. He paused. But I felt lighter when I was done, like something that had been stuck finally came loose. Clara reached out and laid her hand over his. That's something. Is it enough? She considered the question. The weight of it, everything it meant about what came next. I don't know yet, she said honestly. But I'd like to find out. Silas nodded slowly. Then he climbed down and offered her his hand. She took it. They walked toward the house together, not the bunkhouse. The main house, and Silas pushed open the door. I've been thinking, he said, about the spare room at the back. It ain't much, but there's a proper bed, a window that faces the mountains. Clara stopped in the doorway. You're offering me a room in the main house. I'm offering you a choice. He met her eyes. "Stay in the bunkhouse if you want. Nothing changes. But if you want something different," he gestured toward the hallway. "The room's there. Door locks from inside. No expectations. Just closer." Clara looked past him into the house. Ellen's apron still hung on its hook. The table still held 4 chairs, but the air felt different, less like a shrine, more like somewhere living people might live. She stepped inside. "Show me the room." That night, Clara slept in the main house for the first time. The room was small bed, dresser, window facing west toward the mountains. But the mattress was soft, the blankets warm, and when she lay in the darkness, she could hear Silas moving in the room down the hall. Not alone anymore. Neither of them alone. She fell asleep, with the wooden button pressed against her palm, and for the first time since her daughter died. She didn't dream of loss. She dreamed of staying. In the morning, Clara woke to the smell of coffee. She lay still, disoriented. The ceiling was wrong. The walls were wrong. Light came from a different angle. Then she remembered. She dressed quickly and followed the smell to the kitchen. Silas stood at the stove, his back to her. Eggs sizzled in a pan. Biscuits browned in the oven. 2 places had been set at the table. He turned when he heard her. "Morning, morning." Neither mentioned the strangeness of it. Clara took her place. Silas served the food. They ate in a silence that felt comfortable now. Easy in a way silence between 2 people rarely was. When the meal was done, Silas pushed back his chair. "There's something I want to give you." He disappeared into his bedroom and returned carrying a small wooden box. Old, hand-carved. The lid worn smooth from years of handling. He set it on the table in front of her. "Ellen's things, jewelry, mostly. Nothing valuable in terms of money." He paused. "I want you to have it." Clara's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside a cameo brooch, a pair of pearl earrings, a thin gold band, and beneath them, folded small, a piece of paper. Clara unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was faded but clear. A woman's script, elegant and sure. "To whoever finds this after I'm gone, Silas is a good man. Stubborn, proud, and terrible at asking for help, but his heart is true. If you can reach him, if you can make him see that living alone isn't the same as living, then you'll have done something I couldn't finish. Don't let him waste his years mourning mine." Ellen Redmond. March 1877. Clara's vision blurred. She blinked, and tears spilled down her cheeks, the first tears she'd shed in 2 years. "She wrote that when she first took sick," Silas said quietly. "Before either of us knew how bad it would get. I found it after she passed. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away." Clara looked up at him. His eyes were wet too. "She knew," Clara whispered. "She knew you'd need someone. She knew me better than I knew myself." His voice cracked. "Still does. Apparently." Clara rose from her chair, crossed the small distance between them, stood close enough to feel warmth radiating from his body. "I'm not her," she said. "I can't be. I know. I'm not trying to replace her. I know that too." Clara reached up and touched his face. His cheek was rough with stubble, warm beneath her palm. "But I'm here, and I'm staying." Silas covered her hand with his. "That's all I'm asking." They stood that way for a long moment, morning light streaming through the window. coffee cooling on the table, Ellen's letter resting between them. Then Clara stepped back. Work to do. Silas nodded. Always is. They walked out together into the November morning. But at the gate, Silas stopped. A wagon approached from the direction of town, moving fast. That's the Murphy wagon, Silas said. Tom Harkin's driving. Clara's stomach tightened. The wagon pulled up to the gate. Harkins's face was pale, his eyes wide. Redmond, you need to come to town. Now. What happened? Harkins glanced at Clara, then back to Silas. It's Meeks. His mother passed in the night. Heart gave out. He paused. But that ain't why I'm here. Then why, before she died? She changed her will. Whole town's talking. Harkins's voice dropped. She left her share of the Meeks property, near a third of his ranch, to the church. With one condition. Silas's face hardened. What condition? That Harold apologize to you and Mrs. Whitmore, publicly, in front of the congregation. Harkins swallowed. Or the land goes to the territory instead. Clara stopped breathing. He's got until Sunday, Harkins said. If he don't do it, he loses everything. Sunday arrived with frost on the ground and a sky the color of old pewter. Clara stood at the bedroom window, watching her breath fog the glass. The ranch spread before her in the early light, fences mended, windmill turning smooth, garden cleared and waiting for spring. 2 months of work made visible in every repaired board and straightened post. Behind her, the small room held the few things she'd gathered. The empty peach tin, kept anyway, William's pocket watch on the dresser, the wooden button beside it, and now Ellen's cameo brooch, pinned to the collar of her dark wool dress. She touched the brooch. The carved profile felt cool beneath her fingertips. A knock at her door. Clara! Silas's voice, rough with mourning. I'm ready. She opened the door. He stood in the hallway wearing his Sunday coat, worn elbows. Small tear at the cuff he'd never mended. His jaw was clean-shaved, his hair was combed back. But his eyes held something she couldn't quite read. You don't have to come, he said. Whatever Meeks does or don't do, it changes nothing between us. I know. Then why? Because I want to see it. She stepped into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind her. Whatever happens, I want to be there. They walked to the buckboard together, boots crunching on frost-stiffened ground. The horses stamped and blew, breath rising in white plumes. Clara climbed up first. Silas climbed beside her, took the reins. The road to Stillwater unspooled before them. Neither spoke. The silence between them had changed over these weeks, thickened, deepened, become something that didn't need filling. Clara watched familiar landmarks pass, the Murphy fence line, the creek crossing, the rise where the church steeple first showed itself against the sky. Today, wagons crowded the road, more than Clara had seen any Sunday before. They lined the approach to the church, filled the yard, spilled onto side streets. People stood in clusters on the wooden sidewalk, voices a low hum of speculation and waiting. Word had spread. Silas pulled the buckboard to a stop at the edge of the crowd. They climbed down into a sea of curious faces. Redmond, a man Clara didn't recognize, nodded as they passed. Ma'am? Others followed small acknowledgments. Careful nods. Not warmth exactly, but not the hostility of weeks past. Something had tilted in the town's judgment, shifted by an old woman's final act. They made their way to the church steps. The doors stood open. The sanctuary filled past capacity. People stood along the walls, crowded the aisles, pressed against windows for a glimpse of whatever was about to happen. Silas guided Clara through the press, his hand light on her elbow. They found a place near the back, wedged between a farmer in overalls and a woman holding a sleeping baby. At the pulpit, Harold Meeks stood alone. He looked smaller than he had 2 weeks ago, when he'd stood in Silas's yard with 6 men at his back. His black coat hung loose on his frame. His silver watch chain caught the light, but his hands shook where they gripped the lectern. The congregation fell silent. Meeks opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Silas and Clara before sliding away. "I prepared remarks," he said finally. His voice cracked on the second word. "But they don't seem adequate." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper, stared at it, set it aside. "My mother died believing I had become something she didn't recognize." The words came flat, recited. "She told me, before the end, that she was ashamed of the man I'd become, of how I'd used my position to hurt folk who'd done nothing to deserve it." Clara's fingernails pressed into her palms. "She gave me a choice. Apologize public or lose 1/3 of my land." Meeks's jaw worked. "I spent 3 days looking for a way around it. Lawyers, loopholes, anything that would let me keep my pride and my property both." A murmur rippled through the pews. "Couldn't find one." His voice dropped. "And somewhere in all that searching, I started wondering why I was trying so hard, what I was actually protecting." He looked up, and for the first time, his eyes met Silas's directly. Pride. That's all it was. Pride of a man who couldn't admit he'd been wrong. Clara felt Silas go still beside her. "Mr. Redmond," Meeks's voice steadied, "I owe you an apology. Not because my mother's will requires it, but because I said things about your wife, used her memory against you that were cruel and false. Ellen Redmond was a woman of integrity. She would have been first to offer help to someone in need, and I dishonored her by suggesting otherwise." The church had gone absolutely still. Even the baby in the woman's arms had stopped fussing. Meeks turned slightly, his gaze finding Clara in the crowd. "Mrs. Whitmore!" Clara's throat tightened. "I don't know your story. Not really. I made assumptions based on gossip and my own prejudices. Convinced myself that protecting the community's morals justified treating you as less than human." His voice cracked again. "It didn't. Nothing justifies that." He stepped away from the lectern. "I can't undo what I said, can't take back the damage, but I can say, in front of everyone here, that I was wrong, and that I'm sorry." Silence held the room. Then, slowly, Harold Meeks walked down from the pulpit. He moved through the congregation, people parting before him, until he stood directly in front of Silas and Clara. Up close, Clara could see what this moment had cost him. Sweat beading at his temples, hands trembling at his sides. The gray pallor of a man whose view of himself had been stripped away. "Mr. Redmond," he extended his hand. "I don't expect forgiveness, but maybe, in time, we could start fresh." Silas looked at the outstretched hand. Clara watched his face, old anger wrestling with something else. She thought of Ellen's letter. Don't let him waste his years mourning mine. She thought of her own seasons of running, nursing grudges that weighed more than they were worth. Silas took Meeks's hand. Starting fresh sounds about right. They shook once. Brief. Meeks turned to Clara. Ma'am, I don't deserve your forgiveness either, but for what it's worth, I hope you find what you're looking for, here or anywhere else. Clara studied his face, saw the shame there, raw and unconcealed, saw the man his mother had raised, buried beneath years of self-righteousness, struggling toward the surface. I've already found it, she said quietly. Right here. Meeks nodded. His eyes glistened. He turned and walked back toward the pulpit, the congregation parting again to let him through. At the front of the church, he faced them all. Services will continue as normal, but first I'd like to ask Mr. Redmond and Mrs. Whitmore to take a seat in the front pew, where they belong. A murmur ran through the crowd. Clara felt Silas's hand find hers, fingers interlocking. They walked forward together, the congregation watching, and took their seats in the front row. The service proceeded, hymns sung, scripture read. But Clara barely heard any of it. She was aware only of Silas beside her, warmth of his shoulder against hers, weight of his hand still holding hers. When the final hymn ended, people began filing out. But instead of avoiding them, they stopped. Mrs. Patterson reached out and touched Clara's arm. That bonnet looks lovely on you, dear. Peterson nodded gruffly at Silas. Might need extra hands for spring roundup, if you're available. The pregnant woman, Sarah Miller. Clara had learned, squeezed Clara's hand. Come by for coffee sometime. Could use the company. Small gestures, small words, but they built on each other, formed something that felt almost like acceptance. Outside, the November sun had broken through the clouds, the frost had melted, leaving ground dark and damp. Air smelled of wood smoke and horses, and the particular crispness of late autumn. Silas helped Clara into the buckboard. They drove home in silence, but this silence was different, lighter, full of things that didn't need saying. At the ranch, Silas pulled the horses to a stop but didn't climb down. Clara, she turned to look at him. His face held something she'd never seen there before. Hope, maybe, or fear, or both tangled together. I've been thinking, he said, about what comes next. And he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object, brass, old, hand-filed, a key. This is the spare to the main house, he said. Ellen's key. She carried it everywhere, even when she didn't need to, said it made her feel like the place was really hers. Clara's breath stopped. I want you to have it. He held it out, the brass catching sunlight. Not because you need it, doors never locked anyway, but because it means something. Means what? Means you belong here. His voice roughened. Not as a hired hand, not as a guest, as whatever you want to be, whatever we decide to become together. He paused. I ain't asking for promises. I'm just asking if you'll stay, really stay. Not because there's nowhere else, but because this is where you want to be. Clara thought of the road she'd walked to reach this place. Miles of dust and loneliness, towns that turned her away, doors that closed in her face. She thought of William, of her daughter, of the wooden button she still carried. She thought of Ellen's letter, Don't let him waste his years mourning mine. I'll stay, she said. If that's what you're asking. Silas's face changed. The tension drained away, replaced by something that looked like peace. That's what I'm asking. Clara closed her fingers around the key. They climbed down and walked toward the house together. At the door, Silas paused. There's something else. He pushed the door open. Clara stepped inside and stopped. The kitchen table, 4 chairs. 2 empty for years had been set for supper. 2 places, 2 cups, 2 plates. But that wasn't what made her breath catch. On the table, between the settings, sat a small wooden box. New wood, freshly carved. The lid decorated with a pattern of leaves. Clara moved toward it slowly. Made it this week, Silas said from behind her. Nights, while you were sleeping. Remembered you said your daughter carved leaves on that button. Thought maybe. He didn't finish. Clara lifted the lid. Inside, resting on soft cloth, lay her daughter's wooden button. And beside it, the brass key she still held had a match another key. Older, worn smooth from years of carrying, Ellen's original, the one she'd had with her everywhere she went. 2 keys, Silas said quietly. One for you. One that was hers, both in the same place now. Clara's vision blurred. Tears came before she could stop them hot, sudden, releasing something she'd held clenched for 2 years. She wept, not quiet, not delicate, great shuddering sobs that shook her whole body, all the grief she'd carried for William, for her daughter, for the life she'd lost, and the years spent running poured out in a flood she couldn't have stopped if she'd tried. Silas's arms came around her. He held her while she cried, hand stroking her hair, chest solid against her cheek. He didn't try to quiet her, didn't offer empty comfort, just held on, steady as the fences they'd mended, strong as the house around them. When the tears finally slowed, Clara pulled back and looked up at him. Must look a sight, she said, voice rough. You look like somebody who's been carrying too much for too long. He brushed a strand of hair from her damp cheek. You look like somebody who's finally home. Then Clara placed her key in the box beside Ellen's. 2 keys. 2 women who had loved this man. This land. This imperfect life in the middle of nowhere, one gone, one arrived, both belonging. I want to put something else in here, Clara said. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the wooden button, held it for a moment, feeling its familiar edges. Then she placed it between the 2 keys. There, she said. Now they're together. All of them. Silas looked at the box, at the keys and the button and the carved leaves on the lid. That all right? He asked, mixing them that way. Clara closed the lid gently. They ain't mixed, she said. They're joined. That's different. She looked up at him, and something in his face told her he understood. Outside. The windmill turned in the November wind. Cattle lowed in the lower pasture. Chickens clucked in their coop with wire that held tight now. Ordinary sounds. Sounds of a working ranch, a living place, a home. Clara walked to the window and looked out at the land she'd come to know these past weeks. The fence line they'd mended together. The garden she'd cleared. The bunkhouse with its whitewashed porch. Standing empty now, but still part of the story. Silas came to stand beside her. What are you thinking? He asked. Thinking about doors, Clara said. How some close behind you, and there's no going back, and how others open onto something you never saw coming. Silas's hand found hers. I opened the gate that day because I couldn't not, he said. You stood there asking if I needed help, and I couldn't say no. Why not? Because you looked like somebody who'd been walking a long time, and I knew what that felt like. He turned to face her. I'd been walking too, just never left this place to do it. Clara reached up and touched his face. His cheek was rough beneath her palm, warm with life. Then let's stop walking, she said. Both of us, together. Silas covered her hand with his. Together. The word hung between them, simple, vast. A promise made without ceremony. They stood that way as the sun moved across the sky, painting long shadows through the window. The November light turned gold, then amber. Then began its slow fade toward evening. Clara stepped back. Supper to make, always supper to make, and fences to check tomorrow, always fences, and cattle to count, and chickens to feed, and 100 other things needing done. Always. Silas smiled a real smile, the first she'd seen without any weight of grief behind it. That's what a ranch is, work that never ends. Sounds about right. Clara moved to the stove. Silas sat at the table his place, the one he'd occupied alone for 6 years. But now another place was set across from him. Another cup, another plate, another life. Beginning through the window. The windmill turned steady against the darkening sky. The blades caught the last light and let it go, caught and released, caught and released. Clara lit the lamp, the kitchen filled with warm yellow glow, pushing back the November dusk. She moved between stove and table, her steps sure and unhurried, feet tracing paths that would become familiar over years of walking them. Salt pork sizzled in the pan. Cornbread warmed in the oven. Coffee perked on the back burner, its smell filling the room. Silas watched her. Clara. She turned. Thank you, he said, for knocking on my gate. Clara set down the spatula. Thank you for opening it. The lamp flickered once, then steadied, outside. The first stars appeared above the mountains. Coyotes began their chorus, voices thin and wild against the settling dark. But inside, there was warmth. There was light. There was the smell of food cooking and the sound of 2 people breathing in the same small space. There was home. Clara sat down across from Silas. Their eyes met across the table, across the place settings, across all the distance they'd traveled to reach this ordinary moment. She picked up her fork. He picked up his. And outside. The windmill turned on through the night, smooth and quiet now, its gears oiled, its blades steady, keeping time with a rhythm that had room enough for 2. I wrote this story on quiet nights, when the house had gone still and only the clock kept me company. Some of us have lost something, a spouse, a dream, a version of ourselves we thought would last forever. And we learned to live with that empty space, the way Silas lived with the vacant chair on his porch for 6 long years. But sometimes, a knock comes at the door. Not a miracle, not a prince on a white horse. Just another person carrying their own wounds, looking for a place to rest. Clara didn't come to save Silas. Silas didn't open the gate to rescue Clara. They simply chose each other through shared work, through silent evenings on separate porches 30 yards apart, through the courage to stay when everything got hard. That's what love looks like at 50. Not loud, not rushed, just two people deciding that loneliness doesn't have to be the only choice left. My grandmother used to say, "The door you open for someone else might just be the one that leads you home." I believe she was right. This story draws inspiration from classic Western frontier tales and was created solely for entertainment purposes. It does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters, names, and events portrayed in this narrative are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental and unintentional.